Hello, I want to take just 2 minutes before the start of this next episode to answer the question that was set by Charles Buchanan in last week's episode. So Charles asked, what's next for leadership? And in terms of training the next generation of leaders, there's a lot around technology that we can leverage, certainly around artificial intelligence and the use of virtual reality is certainly going to game change the training of the next generation of leaders. And that really does help to then give tailored training to those that to meet the specific needs of people and the specific abilities. So that is really going to sort of game change en masse how we train people in terms of leadership and sort of leadership trends and dealing with specific issues. So that's some amazing things that's likely to come out of that. And obviously, as the world evolves, as our society evolves, leaders have to be at the forefront of being able to evolve with it and be prepared to lead the direction. So leadership is something that we're always going to have to continually learn and train and adapt. So the other thing that I would then caution, whilst technology is now being able to train people en masse and in a tailored specific way, it's to not lose sight of what leadership is about, and it's about people and maintaining those connections with people and doing one-on-one, person-to-person training is still hugely valuable, and I think we shouldn't or mustn't lose sight of that. So I'm going to leave you to watch this week's episode. This week we're talking to Thilan from Australia, and we're talking about dispute resolution. So hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of the Leadership and Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today we're joined by the absolute brilliant Thilan Legierse. Thilan is an executive coach and mediator. So Thilan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. I wanted to really just start off how I start off every single podcast, really. It's just about getting to know you a bit more, getting to understand your background and how you got into sort of executive coaching, what is that, and mediation, and how that fits in with leadership.
Okay. Well, I started my career as a barrister in the Netherlands. So I live now in South Australia, but as my accent will tell, I'm from the Netherlands. And so I started my career as a barrister. And I can honestly say that was a great, plunging into conflict because as a barrister, you deal with conflict all the time. And after 5 years, when I was asked if I wanted to become a partner and get a new lease car, I realized that there was actually something else that I wanted more, which was to work for the United Nations. So I ended up working through the Bar Association in Cambodia, and eventually ended up working for the United Nations on human rights and war crimes in Cambodia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and at the tribunal in The Hague with the awful name, which is International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So basically the tribunal that investigated and prosecuted war crimes in Yugoslavia. Then, a long story short, we decided to move to Australia because we wanted a different life. And when I came here, I had to kind of reinvent myself, and I ended up like an HR manager. But through all the exposure to conflict, to mass graves, to wars, and all the horrible stuff, I always had this feeling drawn to become a mediator and help people resolve conflicts. So I became an HR manager, but I started my own business as a coach and a mediator 7 or 8 years ago. Time flies. And that's what I do now. So I work with leaders and teams, and often they are dysfunctional teams, but also they are great teams who want to be even better. So I teach them, how to do that, how to get the best out of themselves and others, how to resolve conflict, and how to communicate effectively, basically.
And just for those that might not be aware then, so mediation, what is sort of mediation?
Okay, yeah, so mediation is a form of conflict resolution in which you try to empower people. So when you are a lawyer and you go to the courts as a party, you basically put your fate in the hands of a court system. But with mediation, you say, okay, I'm going to try and resolve this with the other party or parties myself. And I'm doing that by having an independent third person, a mediator, and I was, preferably an accredited mediator, but that's a whole different story. But because a lot of people mediate, have no clue what mediation is. And so that as a mediator, I help people resolve conflicts. And I'm pretty how did you say, passionate about that. So I also train mediators, and I accredit for the national system here in Australia, mediators. So that it is a profession, and it takes special skills that are often not the skills that we are used to. So whether you're a social worker or a lawyer, and you want to become a mediator, you have to unlearn a few things. So you can serve parties as best as you can, to say it that way.
Yeah, and sort of your background sort of sets you up perfectly for having all that sort of knowledge and your approach and angle for helping out with conflict and disputes. I don't think it comes as any surprise that within the construction industry, disputes is kind of a bit of a common occurrence. Certainly, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia and the Netherlands, but it's certainly in the United Kingdom, they can be fairly frequent. If you imagine, we're obviously dealing with contracts and large sums of money, huge amounts of large infrastructure projects, and it would take a lot of effort to go one of these large projects with something not going right or not having some sort of disagreement. So a lot of cases, the mediation is the way that people go through to resolve those disputes as a first sort of measure before sort of escalating it even further. So it's not something that's uncommon within the sort of construction industry. Have you dealt with many cases within the construction industry?
Well, I'm just going to be very honest. I tend to focus on workplace mediation. So I have done some conflicts in the construction industry, but more within teams and not so much as like about a big contract. But in general, when people work together and have to collaborate, and what I understand of the construction industries, that you have all these different stakeholders and they all have to kind of come together and finish a project in a way. So I can only imagine, and I know here in Australia they also use a lot of arbitrators, which is a little bit different, because that is a person who will have the final say about a conflict. But I can only imagine that there's lots of conflicts and lots of miscommunication, misunderstandings, and that's often what conflict is all about. It's just the wrong expectations or wrong interpretations of contracts or arrangements, agreements, a lot of frustration, and then it just it just really is like goes really pear-shaped. And then I guess the court system is first of all very expensive, but second of all can take a long time. So mediation is a quicker way, and like I always like to say, it empowers people because you're part of the solution, and it's not like you're asking someone else to kind of come up with the solution. So, yeah.
It's about coming up with an amicable decision at the end that both parties can generally be happy with the outcome. Is that fair?
So, yeah. So I think like what you were saying, I feel I'm at this great stage in my life now where I can combine everything that I've kind of learned throughout my professional life. And so starting with being a lawyer, taking cases to court for the UN, and also here in Australia, I was an investigator. Then I was an HR manager, so I know like investigations are not always the answer, because it is really, you put your case in the hands of an investigator. It can take a long time. People get very frustrated about that. You don't have any say about the outcome, which often is that maybe there's not enough evidence, or that it's an interpretation of the evidence that you're not happy with. So in the end, you feel still frustrated. You still want to go to court. If you go to court, you know, I think when I started as a lawyer, I was 24, and I had this kind of idea that, you know, justice was a big principle, and I've just come to understand that, you know, there is a lot of injustice in the world, and even in the legal system. So that's where I'm coming from, as in, yes, you can do all those things, but it is still very much of having someone else making a decision. Well, if you're mediating, you're sitting down and you're negotiating with the parties that you are in conflict with, and so it feels more empowering, as in you have a say about it. And some stuff you may be able to kind of leave off the table, some stuff you don't, but it feels more to me empowering, and often that's what I hear from people as well. So the other options are more disempowering in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things you mentioned is about we get into disputes and we get into conflict when things aren't clear or misinterpreted. And I think in an ideal world, if everything was written down and agreed with no ambiguities and no conflicts or no errors within any sort of contract documents, or what the expectations were, the expectations were extremely clear, there would never be any conflict. But clearly, I would say in part of any sort of conflict or dispute, it's because of the ambiguities and the this clarity in what the expectations of, if I want something built, got to make sure that what I want is clearly communicated, and what a contractor or consultant is going to deliver is again clearly communicated. And that's actually really quite difficult to make people understand that this is what I want and this is what someone else is going to deliver, and that those two very rarely line up, and that's where we can sort of have that conflict from the start. So as I say, in an ideal world, to get the start right is the way to get the end right.
But I always say, as a mediator, conflict is a given. You know, look at our own personal relationships, or, you know, like, there's always room for misinterpretations. There's times that we just make conclusions that are not really based on the facts, or we get irritated. There's cultural differences. There's all these things that can lead up to misunderstandings. And so if you know, even if sometimes joke, like if you look at history, it started with, you know, Adam and Eve having a conflict over an apple or something. It's just, look in history, there will always be conflict. So for me, that is not really an issue, but the way we deal with conflict is an issue. And so if you've stood like me in front of mass graves and you see what people can do to each other, it's like, okay, there's a conflict, doesn't mean the end of the world. We can sit down as humans and discuss this and come up with a solution that is okay for everyone. Yes, we might have to put our ego a bit to the side, or, you know, we actually might be able to learn something from ourselves and others, but that is the best way forward, given that there will be conflict no matter what. be it at work, be it with a contractor, um, be it in a relationship, be it with your family. But it will happen. But how you're going to deal with it when it happens? And so there's ways that people deal with it, which is, for instance, they just kind of avoid it, and so they think that's going to be okay, and they can kind of kid on that it doesn't really exist, and then it kind of explodes and it only gets worse. Or that you can, there's actually 5 styles, but you can, for instance, accommodate the other person and constantly say, okay, well, I'll give you what you want and so on. But that in the end doesn't work either, because then you feel that your needs are not being valued. And, why is that person getting everything? I mean, you can say, well, I don't give a hoot. And I'm just gonna win this conflict. I'm just gonna take what it is that I want, which works really well for you, but not for your relationships. People will despise you, will try and go behind your back, and will do anything if people feel disempowered and they don't dare to tell you, like, hey, you're being a bully, or you're forcing me to do things I don't want to do. But they'll do it in sneaky ways. So. And then there's the compromise, which is something that we're all very used to, which is almost socially acceptable, like let's compromise. But then we don't really talk about the issues. And then we've got collaboration. How do you work together? How can you kind of say, okay, let's sit down. What's your issue? I want to understand where you're coming from. Why is this so important for you? And let me explain from my side why this is important for me and how I come to interpret this in this way. And then you can have that conversation. And that's what actually a mediator helps people to have that conversation. But you can do that yourself if you have the skills. And let's just sort this out for once and for all. And as adults, and move on and learn from it. So there's all these different ways of dealing with it.
Yeah, I think potentially one of the most sort of damaging things with relationships, if you're trying to build teams, if within an organization, or even just a project team on a particular project, if there is the potential there for a conflict, it's almost sometimes more damaging if you do try to bury your head and ignore it and forget that it's there. I think where there's conflict and where there's a potential for a dispute, or there's clear ambiguity, that someone's, maybe it to one party it's not ambiguous, I completely understand, but certainly to another it doesn't make sense. There's a potential there that things could go pear-shaped, and to bury a head and dismiss it, I think, is actually more damaging to the relationship and to how the outcome ultimately, than dealing with it directly head on. And so those sort of 3 things you touched on, sort of accommodating,
compromising. Absolutely, yeah. But I just want to be real as well. So first of all, I think you hit the nail on the head, and that's when leadership comes in. And that's when leaders need to be able to see that there is conflict or potential for conflict, and need to not stick their head in the sand and have, sweep it under the carpet. But the second thing is that if people are not comfortable with conflict, you need to kind of give yourself a break, because eventually, the sun's coming through the window here, and notice, eventually, as human beings, it's quite normal that we are not okay with conflict. Because if you look at our background, and when we were living in tribes, if we were to have conflict, then our lives would be at stake, because what could happen is we could be thrown out of our tribe. So we're almost genetically disposed to having a fear for conflict. But it's like the fight, flight, and freeze, the amygdala stuff. It's a choice So you can say, okay, well, that's maybe what my brain is telling me, but actually it's okay. I'm safe. I can have conflict. And it doesn't mean that I'll be thrown out of the tribe and will die on my own because I can't fetch my own food kind of thought. I'm going to move my computer a little bit to see if that's, yeah. Okay.
It's nice to see the sun because here it's nearly 11 o'clock at night. So it's just got moon if there was no clouds.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's if you're really fearful of conflict, I think that can also then change how you approach it. So if you acknowledge then there's something that needs to be done, something that needs to be said, sometimes it just builds until there's an explosion of all these emotions and all these problems that have been building up for some time. Or it can just be one thing that you know, it completely approached in completely the wrong way. So what are sort of ways in which, if we are finding potential for disputes and conflict, in which we can approach it in a way that doesn't backlash and because I think the reason why we're so fearful, as you say, you know, if you put conflict in or are confrontational, then others are confrontational back. They feel like they've got to protect themselves and fight back. And very much the leader's role, as you were mentioning, is to create that environment where it's okay to have those sort of hard, difficult conversations about conflict and disputes and ambiguities, which doesn't have to be confrontational where everybody ends up in an argument. So what are the sort of things that leaders can do in creating that environment, but also in what people can do in how they approach conflict so that it doesn't end up in a massive confrontation?
Yeah, okay. Well, great question. So first of all, I think what I always say if I do training, and I say, is there one thing you're taking away from this whole day, is that conflict is actually an opportunity. So if you start seeing conflict as an opportunity to deepen relationship, to really clarify issues, and to create change and transformation. And so that instead of having that negative association, oh my God, oh, we're having a conflict, oh, it's going to increase, it's going to get icky, it's going to be horrible, just try and see, okay, there seems to be some misunderstandings, there's some conflict, there's irritations, whatever, can be really high-end conflict as well. And be confident with it. So I've got a course, it's called Confident with Conflict, because if you're confident with conflict and you realize that it exists and it has nothing to do with you, it's just been around forever. And as a leader say, okay, I am acknowledging this and I'm going to be confident with it. I'm not going to be afraid of it. And it reminds me a little bit of my mom. I'm the eldest of our family. My mother always said, you know, if you're the eldest, so you need to be the wisest. So as a leader, you need to be the wisest. And sorry, there's a lot of things I want to say, but one of the other things is the fact is that as human beings, we don't learn how to deal with conflict. It's one of my pet peeves. Like, I wish it was taught at school. So most people will not know how to deal with conflict. So as a mediator, I constantly sit with people who are taking antidepressants, are seeing psychiatrists, psychologists, who don't sleep at night, who lost 20 kilos or gained 20 kilos because they're so stressed about conflict. So as a leader, if you know that conflict exists, that there is, that you need to acknowledge that and be confident with it, and that you also need to acknowledge that most people find conflict very difficult and don't know how to deal with it. So they go over the top, they either avoid it altogether or they go full in and they make things worse. So knowing that you've got a role to help people resolve conflict. And it starts with acknowledging that and having the courage to step in then. And so I often say, as a mediator, I feel I'm a bit like a doctor. So there's a wound. And so I'm going to have to open the wound, and sorry for the graphic, but and really clean it all out, get all the, I'm trying to be very polite, get all the stuff out, and just clean the wound, and then the wound can heal. So with conflict, the best thing to do is to go where the pain is. So if I am avoiding what the other person is upset about, then I won't be able to resolve it. But if I understand, hey, just say something, hey, John, I know these are your frustrations, or tell me your frustrations. That is even better. Tell me your frustrations, and then acknowledge them and give them back to that person. Say, okay, I get it. Can you give me some more details? Can you give me specifics? And then you can do the same for yourself. Then you're having a conversation. And it's not about being right and wrong. You and I can walk on the street and there's a man lying, and you may have a different interpretation than I have, you know. You might think he's homeless, and I might think he's an alcoholic who just had a heart attack or something, you know. So we all look at facts differently, and just to understand it, and that's what a mediator tries to shift perspectives. So you've got a story in your head, and often we are the hero and we are the victim, and things are done to us, and the others are idiots, and you know they don't get it, and da da da. But if you have those honest conversations, then you can hear their side of the story and say, okay, well, I didn't know that, or I wasn't aware of that, or never looked at it that way. That's when you can have those conversations and say, okay, then it comes down to what are your real needs? What is important for you? Well, for us, these aspects of the contract are important. For us, these aspects are important. So how can we work together in a way that we're both getting what we need without feeling that we have to give in too much? And that what happens then is you need to look at creative solutions. You need to be able to kind of keep your own emotions in tow. You need to be able to be open-minded and be willing to let go of that story that you've maybe had in your head for a long, long time, and you've been telling everyone. And so it takes a lot of, courage and leadership to say, okay, you know, I'm going to be open-minded, and I'm going to try and role model how we can resolve conflicts here instead of, you know, making it worse. But it does take mental energy and time.
And you think it's healthy between parties to open a wound and get it all laid out and open in the air, and really just discuss through those topics so that they can resolve those and move on?
I personally always say that's the difference between a good mediator and a great mediator, because if you don't, then things keep niggling. So if you just go with the easy stuff and the difficult stuff remains undiscussed, then it keeps festering in people's minds. So if I really feel you treated me like shit, or you betrayed me or something, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm just going to talk about, say, the wrong colors of tiles, I just say something stupid, then that is not going to resolve the conflict, because it's actually much deeper, and I'm going to still feel the resentment that I initially had because I haven't been really able to discuss that with you. And so you maybe come to a kind of a compromise or a solution, but then it's artificial. And that's why I say, well, just get everything out, and then again, you don't have to agree. And say, okay, well, I understand now that you feel I betrayed you, and you know, I'm sorry to hear that, but from my perspective, I didn't, for instance, and here's why I feel I didn't, or whatever. It really helps to restore that human connection, and then people always say, oh, and trust is broken and can never work with you again, and blah blah blah. And I always say, well, you know, trust is a feeling, so you can't really say, oh, as from tomorrow 4 p.m. I trust you again. But, you know, just as a leader, but also as a leader teaching others, at least open the door and say, okay, I'm going to give you a sliver of trust. I'm going to kind of try to restore this relationship, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and I ask you to do the same for me. So often always, when I help people resolve conflicts, I also say, well, what if this happens again in the future? What have you learned from this, and what can you do differently? And so one of the first things is that if you feel irritated, or if you feel things aren't going right, it's just to kind of say, okay, stop. I'm not making a judgment. I'm not going to color this in. I'm just going to hear the story, and I'm just going to say, hey, John, I thought we had agreed that we would, trust each other. And, now you're doing this. What's happening? And just listening, instead of already, making that assumption like, oh, here we go again. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of...
I'm talking a lot.
No. There's a really lot of good stuff in all this. The three things I can really sort of touch on. I mean, the one thing that you mentioned right at the start was about how we don't teach in class about conflict and things like this. And I sort of recall when, as a parent, when my two young eldest children are fighting over a toy, or someone they've done something they don't like, trying to sort of really, you become the mediator in this scenario, and you have to try and get the other two to understand it from the other perspective, and which as a child that's extremely difficult. But I think on just a parenting note, because I see parenting very similar to leadership, I think it's healthy for children and for parents and for society that we do openly with your children do that mediation and get them to see it from other perspectives and deal with conflict, and not just run away and I'm leaving. I've heard that before. At 4 years old, I'm leaving, and just goes up to his bedroom. It doesn't help. Yeah. So what does help is when you can try and get them to talk and open it up. The other thing about sort of getting everything out in the open, I think you can learn a lot from yourself in that opportunity, as you mentioned. Things that you do that you're not quite aware of. So it's great for your self-awareness that because everybody's different, you might act in a certain way, which is fine for 99 people, but for that 100th person, it might really rub them up the wrong way. So you can really learn a lot about yourself. And so one of the things that I can relate that to in terms of what we do in the construction industry, or certainly what we do a lot of in my sector, is try to have lessons learned meetings at the end of projects and look at things that have gone well and things that have gone badly. And I have to say, I had some really great conversations with people towards the ends of projects. And you say lessons learned, a lot of people's eyes will go, oh, I don't really want to do that. It's a bit, you might underput an argument, don't mention this, don't mention that. But actually, when you really hear from even your client or the contractor things that maybe they weren't happy with and something that you can improve on, I've taken a lot away from those meetings sometimes and improved the way the way I do things, because I've learned things about myself and I've learned things about them, and I think it does benefit people, and then the next client gets the benefit of that lesson learned because I can do it differently.
I think that's absolutely great, and I really believe in lessons learned. And I always say that because I do work a lot with teams or organizations, and I actually said it this week to the team, like, I think you should have a case scenario, like if something happens, well, what can we have learned from this? And this was in a school environment, and what can we do differently? And I think, as a leader, especially, in general, self-reflection is really important. But as a leader, to help your team self-reflect and say, okay, how can we even become even better, is absolutely crucial.
And for the individuals, sorry, I was going to say, for the individuals in that team, if they feel like, as a team, as a unit, almost like a family, if we're getting better and we're growing and we're providing better service and we're holding ourselves to higher standards, it helps with inspiration, it helps with motivation, that they feel like a tight-knit team, that we're bettering ourselves. If you don't go around bettering yourselves and you do make the same mistakes every single time, so you don't improve, it doesn't really give much for people to stick around with that. I'd argue.
and teams need to be engaged. And like, if you have like the lesson learned is your manager berating the team and that's not motivational. Like, exactly, if you want to change your culture, if you want to get better, you talk about it without blaming or pointing the finger, but just saying, hey, let's take a look more at the facts and take the emotions out. And that was one thing I actually wanted to say as well. I realized I didn't really say that emotions, we are first and foremost emotional beings. So emotions in the workplace or are very normal. So I'm not saying nobody should be upset or pissed off or disappointed or whatever, but it's okay. You can acknowledge it and take some time, but then move on. So I think what I often hear is when I come in, and it's like a whole organization, and people say we have to be professional here, and I always say, like, what does that mean? So we're still human beings, so there needs to be room for emotions, but it shouldn't be all consuming. It should be, okay, we acknowledge that. So what can we do differently, or how can we move forward, or what can we do for you to join us or whatever?
No, I agree with that. And I think that sounds to me like a way of helping people build resilience, because to me part of that is understanding and being attuned, being emotionally intelligent, understanding how you're feeling and recognizing that, and then how you deal with that with certain situations. And when people listen to what you did made me feel like this, and the opposite party accepts that and understands that and sort of acknowledges it, that just help them sort of get in a bit closer and go, okay, now I've dealt with that, and it builds their sort of own resilience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have an online leadership course, and it has 3 tiers. One is to lead yourself first, and then to lead others, and to lead transformation. So I think that everything starts with leading yourself and being able to understand and be aware of your own emotions and build your resilience and not take everything too personal, know who you are and become comfortable with that. And I always say, like, become like an oak tree, like be really grounded. And that also means knowing your weaknesses, or, things you're not that great at, because that's so important. And yeah, I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. So we're coming sort of close now to sort of the end of the podcast. One of the questions that I always like to ask people, well, it isn't really a question really, it's more for you to give me a question for me to answer at the beginning of the sort of next podcast. So do you have a question that you'd like to ask me?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of time to think about it, but I think that that the question would be really nice for, what do you think would be really important for leaders to become more confident with conflict, and how they can kind of, if they don't have any professional development or anything, what can they start with as a basis of accepting conflict, and then having that role model of doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. How leaders can become comfortable with conflict.
Yeah, even if they feel like at this moment I can't go to a course or anything, but what can you start doing just to kind of allow yourself to realize, oh, conflict is a given, and how am I going to deal with it? And I actually have a thing on my website. I'm not sure if I can promote that. It's called the Easy Peasy Difficult Conversation Formula. And so if people are interested, you can download it from my website, and it has all the steps on how to have a difficult conversation. Sorry, I just realized that that it's a resource that people find very useful. So that's maybe something, if they can't do a course, that they can start with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you very much. And I think one of the key things is when we're entering into sort of commercial contracts within a construction industry, when we're being appointed to build something or design something, being able to get the right group of people from both sides of the parties that are able to sort of deal with conflict. And I think you get a sense for that when you meet the people. And if you can get the right people together, that that you can work through issues, because if you acknowledge, as you say from the start, that we will get through this, there will be conflicts and disputes along the way, but if we've got the right people from both parties and we can work through those, as you say, it's like any sort of relationship, whether it be a friend or a partner, that you're going to end up having arguments about something. And what makes you stronger, what makes you a good friend or a good partner, is to be able to work through those amicably and one that is agreeable, not just compromise.
Yeah, and not just the legal stuff in a contract. I mean, having been a lawyer myself, it just often doesn't really mean anything if you're on the work floor, So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great.
So the last question I would like to ask you then is, what do you think is the most important aspect of leadership?
Very difficult question. I really think that leadership starts with yourself, and with self-leadership, and with integrity. Say what you do and do what you say. And if you can't do it, just communicate that. So I think what I see is when teams and people get really frustrated if they have a leader who is out of integrity and isn't authentic. So if you don't know things as a leader, which we all agree it's not the 1950s anymore, and leadership is very complex, just be open and honest about it. But it's those role model that it's okay not to know everything, and that you need a team, and that how do you say, the sum of the team members is always bigger than just the 4 members. I'm speaking double Dutch now, I think, but you know what I mean. Like it's about a team. So be self-aware and lead yourself first before you start leading others.
Absolutely, that's brilliant. I couldn't put it better myself. So Thilan, thank you very much for your time today and sharing some of this really valuable information around dispute resolution, conflict resolution, and having those really difficult conversations. So thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Michael, for having me on this wonderful podcast.
Thank you. Cheers.